Can't think of anyone better to talk to than someone who sat face-to-face with Vladimir Putin himself on behalf of Trump himself. Joining me now is Donald Trump's former national security advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. So we were just talking about this during the break. I mean, this has been quite a week. You know, you start with Trump saying that Russia can do whatever they want as it relates to NATO countries. It continued with a complete standstill on aid to Ukraine, something they desperately need given the progress Russia's made even over the weekend. It ended, of course, with the death of Alexei Navalny. And you've sat in a lot of these rooms, many of them. I just wanted to ask you sort of how does he consume what's happening here in the United States? Trump's words, or lack of words, I should say, in some cases?
Well, I think he sees things moving in his direction. And he really outdid himself in terms of disinformation. A couple of days ago, a reporter asked, well, what do you think of Biden versus Trump? And he said, well, Biden's predictable and so on, implying he was endorsing
What did you
Biden.
Make of that when you heard that?
It's a clear disinformation effort to
confuse people,
to give Trump the opportunity, which he was foolish enough to take, to say, well, I thought that was actually a compliment to me. I mean, if Trump is elected, there'll be celebrations in the Kremlin. There's no doubt about it, because Putin thinks that he is an easy mark.
Easy to manipulate. I mean, this week there was also some pretty big news about Trump having to pay now. I mean, it's $450 million from just this week with interest. You're familiar with how foreign capitals think about these things. Are you worried about Trump having all of this money he owes and being a target in that way of people like Putin and other foreign authoritarian or autocrats?
Well, I think it's going to result in him having to liquidate some of his properties. I don't see where he's going to get the cash, although it's not really a near-term problem. He'll appeal. He'll have to post a bond, of course. But I think these are the things that really affect him most immediately, because this is his money. And let's face it, what Donald Trump cares about most of all is Donald Trump, and particularly Donald Trump's money.
But could foreign autocrats, I mean, they look and they target. You said he's a good target. Could they look at him and think, he's a good target. He owes tons of money. He's got to liquidate assets. He may not even have it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the demonstrations why Trump really is not fit for office. He is consumed by these troubles. His family is consumed by them. And I think foreigners will try to take advantage of it one way or another. They may be doing it already.
Let me ask you just about Navalny, because Alexei Navalny is, of course, a very prominent opposition leader. He has bravely been in jail. He spent 300 plus days in sort of almost an isolated, freezing cold cell. Democrats and Republicans, not enough Republicans, I will say, have spoken out. Nikki Haley has. Trump has been completely silent. He had a 2-hour speech yesterday, said nothing. What do you make of that?
Well, heaven forbid he say anything critical of Vladimir Putin. Look, accidents don't happen in those kinds of Russian prison camps. When Navalny's mother asked to take care of the body, they refused to give it to her, and they told her that...
Because they wanted to have an autopsy.
They told her the cause of death was sudden death syndrome. Well, I'd sure like to know what that is. Maybe it means you're alive one minute and dead the next. I don't know what else it can mean. But, you know, 4 years ago, when Navalny was the victim of an attempted assassination by poisoning, other people immediately condemned what was obviously the Kremlin's weapon of choice against its opponents, poisoning. Trump didn't comment on it, said he didn't have information to judge. I mean, he's only the president of the United States at that point. So it's obviously part of a pattern. He simply doesn't want to criticize his friend Putin, because in Trump's mind, if he's got a good relationship with Putin, the U.S. has a good relationship with Russia. This is the kind of thing that tells Putin that Trump simply doesn't know what he's doing.
There has also been alarming news this week about Putin's reported efforts to put a nuclear weapon in space to target American satellites. There's not a ton we know about it exactly, but it did make some news this week. The ban on nuclear weapons in space was among the topics that Putin said was on his agenda to discuss with Trump back in Helsinki. Now, that was in 2018. You were the national security advisor at the time. Trump did a lot of that one-on-one. But was it a topic that came up or was discussed in any way?
No, I don't believe so. You know, they say it's one-on-one, but there are always two interpreters, one for each side. And I will say that my staff, immediately after the one-on-one ended, went to the U.S. interpreter and said, what did they talk about? Most of it was about Syria, and Putin did most of the talking. So I consider that a victory. The less time Trump is actually saying anything to Vladimir Putin, that's a good thing. Nothing came out of it. We had a lunch right after it, and I'm confident nothing sensitive was discussed.
there's no question, you've talked about this a fair amount, and I'm even familiar with this from my time in the national security world. Every country's watching what's happening globally. And I wanted to ask you about President Xi and how he is watching, say, the events of the past couple of weeks, where the dysfunction in Washington has meant that there's no funding currently moving forward and no clear path to support Ukraine. So Putin has kind of a free game there. And they have, of course, aggression that they are considering as it relates to Taiwan and other territories in the region. How do they watch this? Did they think, oh, we're safe from the U.S.? There's nothing that's going to happen here?
No, they're exuberant in Beijing. Remember, this aid package should include aid to Taiwan, which can use it immediately if they could get their hands on it. This is the sort of navel gazing that America sometimes gets into, which its foreign adversaries take advantage of. And in Beijing right now, they're looking at the war in Ukraine, they're looking at the war in the Middle East, and they're saying to themselves, you know, the Biden's attention is diverted by 2 wars, a difficult presidential campaign. What should we be doing to take advantage of the United States? So I'm surprised, actually, we haven't seen more trouble along China's Indo-Pacific periphery. It may come. But, you know, looking at Donald Trump, the only question in my mind, if Trump is reelected, is whether the bigger celebration will be in the Kremlin or in Beijing, because they, too, see Donald Trump as an easy mark.